I want to talk a little bit about the spiritual journey because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about it, a lot of diverse views, diverse experiences, and diverse paths on that so called spiritual journey. Now, it has to be this way because it can't be in any other way. It has to be this way because every single entity, and when I use the word entity, I mean anyone who thinks that they are an individual in a world isolated from the world with many other individuals and entities. That's what I'm talking about. Now, every entity has a sort of a unique take on life. And the reason for this is because we have all us entities have trodden a very different path from each other. We've experienced different things. We've experienced different challenges, problems. And there's different things that we've seen and heard. And since we only can look through, since we only can look through the very limited perspective of where we come from, then our worldview and what we think about it is going to be very restricted. Somebody who's gone through a lot of pain and trauma, they're going to be sensitive to certain things, you see, because that pain and that trauma has basically lit up some aspect, within them that gives them that clarity. And there is not one pain. There's a multitude of pains, a multitude of sufferings. And every individual and their suffering is something that's very unique and personal to the collective circumstances that they've gone through. Now, I mean, what do we do? Do we basically, carry it as some sort of a badge of honor or what? I don't think it's about that. I think it's whatever it is that we've gone through. It's just, I think, in the higher scheme of things, that I've got no evidence to actually make this assertion. It's just a sort of like a personal observation or a perspective. I think whatever we go through, suffering is a sort of like a spotlight, When we go through it, it sort of shines a sort of a big light on, dark little corners where all sorts of things are sort of hidden, And the ones that are the most painful things that we sort of uncover with this light of suffering is delusion about our own identity and who we think we are. And we think when we're going through suffering, we think that, my problems, what I'm going through, those are the thing in itself that has meaning. But that's not actually true. Really, what the truth is those are just pointers, They are like Like, for example, like, when you're in the dark, okay, and you're trying to navigate from one dark place into another dark place, that suffering is like a sort of a light that lights up, that, just basically gives you like a thunderlight, for example, like, on a dark night. Imagine navigating through the countryside, through a mountainous region, and you haven't even got a light with you. That thunderlight, when it basically strikes, it's very fearful. But for a second, split second, it illuminates the whole countryside, the mountainside. And for a brief second, you can see, that this is the way. This is the way that I have to navigate, And it sort of puts you back on track. And I think suffering is analogous to that. It sort of puts you back on the track. When you've fallen off the track, suffering is going to come and visit you so that you can re-see, your path, where you need to be basically heading. You might ask yourself then, okay, if suffering is necessary to point me in a certain direction because I've lost my way, then why does it keep on happening again and again and again? Well, here's the problem, my friend. The problem is that even when the path is shown to us, we often fail to actually take it. And why? Because there's a whole bunch of other things that are competing for our attention. So we give our attention to those things and we forget the path that we've been shown. So hence we get lost again. And then more suffering comes. Is there really a solution to all of this? I hear you ask. I don't really know how to answer that for you. I think there is, some sort of a grand solution to all of it. You look at the world and you see that there is some sort of order. Nothing is, random, like, like a sort of like the old-fashioned TV, when the aerial wasn't attached and you just see, like, little speckles on the screen, and it's all, random noise. So there is order in the world, everything seems to be organized. To a very great extent, actually, I mean, even if you, for example, look at all of the things that are living on this planet right now, these things have evolved from through billions of years of evolution, to come to a sort of a state where they are still living, they're still here to see the sun rise one more time, And if it was all randomness, then we wouldn't be seeing this, right? So maybe there is some greater intellectual intelligence that's out there, to whose will, for want of a better word, everything is unfolding. But we can't speculate about those things too much because we haven't seen that thing, right? We don't see it anywhere. Or we see the signs of it, because nothing is, the world that we see is not random, it's not random noise. It's organized, it's structured, you know. And whatever little part you take, you can dig in its history of its evolution, and you can see, this is where, it's come. And one of the things I think is quite problematic as human beings is that we often think we're divorced from the rest of nature. We think that we have, we're somehow different, Perhaps, we're the most intelligent species on the planet, and we're somehow separate from the rest of the planet and all the other living beings and so forth. But I don't think so. I think even these bodies, for example, if you look at our bodies, we got distinct organs that perform very specific functions, and they are very tightly integrated. If one part was to fail, the whole organism would fail, right? And if we delve even deeper into, for example, human cells, just one tiny cell, okay, and you look at that in more detail, and you see that there is so much organization, so much structure, so much thought, that I've been a sort of an architect of sort in my life, and human beings tend to design things, in very specific ways, and the architect takes into consideration these are the aspects that I need to take into consideration to make sure that this particular system that I'm designing, is able to basically deal with whatever situation comes up and remains coherent. But if you look at the just the organism of the cell, you know, within the cell there's so many processes, so many interactions that are taking place that it sort of alludes to, some sort of a design, right? But we can't see any sort of a designer. There's no designer in sight, but, its fingerprints are everywhere. So, so coming back, I think, coming back, I started off talking about suffering and suffering being the sort of a means to get us back on the track. And that life, if you look, we're not, human beings are not divorced from the life that exists on this planet. We're actually all part of it, right? And there is some sort of a grand scheme, or at least, what we see, if we are really honest with ourselves, look at the world, we can intuit that there is some sort of a grand scheme taking place, We can't see the designer. There's no, you know, there's no, there's no evidence that there is a designer, you know, other than looking at the design itself, yeah. But what does it mean for you and me, I mean, we're here. We found ourselves in this world, in this situation, going through whatever circumstances, we happen to basically go through, you know, and we can say, if you are religious types, and again, basically, what is religion, Religion is a sort of like a cultural belief. I don't want to sort of diminish it to sort of a level where it seems disrespectful. I want to say religion is a sort of like the collective knowledge of a culture, you know. It arises from the best of beings within that particular culture that really, shone a bright light that allowed that culture to sort of move forward, right? So I don't want to diminish the importance of religion, you know. All I'm saying is that we're shaped by it, you know. That because we come from different perspectives, our experiences, what we go through, how we interpret things, interpret events, for example, the event may be just basically the closing of a door, but it could be interpreted in a million and one different ways, depending on how you look at it. And the point of saying this, all of this is that each of us have a very different perspective, which is colored by what we have gone through previously in our life. And that determines what we see, how we interact, and so forth. Now, here's the kick, really. And the kick is this, okay? So, look at the apple tree, for example. Like, every spring it basically blossoms, it knows now is the time for me to arise and throw out my shoots from these barren branches and twigs, throw out my shoots and then produce a blossom, a flower, with the hope that something is going to basically come and pollinate it so that I can create a seed that will produce something that can basically carry on in this journey. I might not be here, says the apple tree, but my progeny will be here, And we see that, does the apple tree, is there any thinking going on in that apple tree? Does it say, okay, it has a little calendar on its wall like human beings, and it says, okay, yeah, we're approaching end of March. I've got to think about budding those flowers. Otherwise, it's not going to be a good season. I don't think that's the case. I think the apple tree blossoms because that's what the apple tree does. Apple tree blossoms. The bees come and do their pollination. The fruits produce. The apple falls. The seed germinates and another apple tree, right? And if that is something that's happening at a sort of an apple level, human bodies are not divorced from that process. I mean, really think about it. Us human beings, we're also part of the very thing that we're seeing, but we sort of elevate ourselves to some sort of like a pseudo sort of egotistical level where we think we're divorced from nature and nature's intent, So when I say nature's intent, what I mean is that automated thing that exists within the apple tree that knows when to blossom, right? But when we look at human beings, we say a human being, has free will, and a human being basically can choose their destiny. And I think here is basically something that we need to be a bit more, discernful about, okay? And the discerning thing is this, so what is it that gives me free will, but, relegates the apple tree to basically just the forces of nature and gives me somehow some sort of an independence? And the thing is, if you really look at it very closely, I don't think there is anything that gives license to free will just to human beings. Or let's just be a bit more accommodating, say maybe even to higher forms of life, like, some of, for example, dolphins or something along those lines. Now, now the thing is this, is these things, this little nuance, okay, we say, okay, an amoeba is only awake to a certain extent, like, and then we look at sort of like plant life and we think, it's more collection of different types of cells all working in unison to, look at or maintain the integrity of what's produced the apple tree, right? When we look at human beings, but somehow that sort of idea of free will sort of creeps in, like, and it's particularly pernicious in human beings because we seem to have elevated ourselves to be something that's above nature. And I don't think that's the case. I think if I look at the world, all I see is everything basically unfolding, not to some sort of like a divine will that I know of, but it seems to be the case that everything is unfolding to some sort of like a structural unfolding. It's not chaotic, It's not random. There are certain things that it 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 favors, certain things that it sort of like suppresses. What is that? Can you call that like some sort of like, I don't know, whether, for example, more primitive societies, animalistic societies are basically seen God in nature. But I don't think they're primitistic. I think, that's actually a very good view to explain, like, that there is some sort of a primordial force that allows for this unfolding to take place in a very structured and organized way. And I think it's human arrogance to think that we are somehow separated from that. Now, if you take a step back and just look at, like, what does it mean for me though, because I think as a human being, as an ego, the way that you've been brought up, right, it's always going to be about me, okay? Especially here in the West. If you're brought up in the West, it's a very sort of an egocentric, independent sort of a driven worldview to say, look, you're a unique entity, you have free will, you can do and shape whatever, and you do it, right? So, but the thing is, what's not actually told is, look, you have no real free will. I mean, free will actually, to me, would mean absolute freaking power, like, to do whatever I wanted, to shape basically reality according to my whims, the way from moment to moment. But no, I mean, human free will, okay, yeah, we're constrained. Okay, we need to build, I want to get to the other side of that mountain, but there's no road, so I have to build a road, right? So you're constrained by the mountain. Like, you can't will the mountain away and say, get rid of the fucking mountain. I want to go straight to the other side of where, you know. So human beings, even though we're given this impression that we have free will, it's very, very highly tempered by physical constraints, environmental constraints, constraints placed upon us by the world that we can't overcome, that we have to somehow figure our way out. Okay, if the mountain's standing in the way, I'm gonna have to build a fucking road right through that. So So now I guess we come to a point where we perhaps need to sort of question our sort of, free will, So I think it's worth questioning your free will, because I think to basically just blindly accept that we have free will and also accept the fact that our free will is not complete or absolute. It's constrained by things that we can't, outwill, By outwill, I mean to basically say, no, we don't want that. I don't want a mountain there. I just want to go straight through. So, so if you're constrained and the perspective that we have free will is limiting because there are these constraints, then do we really have free will? You know? I mean, for example, I look at my left toe right now, and within my left toe, there is many, many different types of, cells, and each of those cells have little mitochondrial DNA inside them. That is the energy house of that little cell, right? It produces the energy that drives that cell, and there's some force that basically says, the cell now has to divide into two, and the one dies and one carries on, and so forth and so forth. I don't have control over that. It's delusion. I mean, to think I got control over that. Do I have control over my liver? Do I have control over my breathing even? Breathing is a good one because it's sort of like a temporary control. We have, for example, we can pause our breathing for a certain period of time. At least that's how it seems. But breathing still happens, even in the background. When we're not consciously paying any effort towards our breathing, it still happens. So I think free will, to say it is free will, is not. There may be sort of a progressive, what's the word? A sort of a progressive limit to our free will. Maybe in certain aspects we can exercise certain amount of control, but overall we're constrained by the environment. Absolutely. And I think there's more constraints than there are actually avenues of free expression. So, I mean, you can put all these things together and come to your own conclusion. But all I'm saying is there seems to be basically limits to the sort of grandiose, Western liberalism that basically says, human beings are ultimately in charge of their destiny. No, we're not. One little asteroid and just basically, out of the Kuiper belt it comes, hits Earth, basically wipes out humanity, All our progress for a millennia or many millennia, it's just gone, wiped out, for something else to come, some nature, nature will evolve, nature will never be destroyed, it'll just be an opportunity for something else to arise, So I guess the saying of all of this is basically to bring you to a place where I think we need to, as somebody who's discerning, right? If you discern these things, you can see these things, then we have to come back to the place where we actually look at the truth of ourselves, who the hell are we really? I mean, who is it the thing that sees through these eyes, hears with these ears, smells with his nose, touches with his fingers, tastes with his lips, or the tongue. Who is that thing? Who is it that it all comes to? And I think that's actually the very beginning of your journey. Because everything that proceeded before it is it's basically orientated outwards. It's looking at the world, looking at how it operates, how it works, trying to figure out some sort of like some formula that explains it, some calculation. But the more you look at it, the more you see that actually, it's much, much bigger than any sort of formula I can actually place upon it. You can't really reduce it to a formula. Maybe there's certain or behavioral or aspect related patterns that you can say, this formula works, right? But it's only in a very sort of a narrow context. I think the real journey really basically starts if we are to get to a sort of a place where we have a more comprehensive, I wouldn't say understanding, but a sort of a comprehensive, it's like a sort of a jigsaw puzzle, right? And coming to a sort of place where you're trying to place a piece and it just won't basically fit. And eventually that piece fits, right? And all of a sudden, the whole jigsaw puzzle, the whole pattern, the whole image is basically seen for what it is, right? And I think that's also true from us. Us, when I say us, I mean humanity, right? For us, maybe also for other higher beings, I don't know. But certainly for human beings, I think that like realizing, okay, I was this jigsaw piece, that needed fitting into this particular slot. And when I was in this slot, then I was complete. And I think that's what the human journey is all about. I think all of these billions and billions years of like effort that have taken place, like, from for example, like, at the very beginning we're told, like, if you go with the Big Bang Theory, the very basic elements, not all of the 100 and whatever they are of the elements that exists, naturally in the world. you know there only existed hydrogen or maybe helium, the very sort of base, elements, and they condense to basically form stars. And those stars then basically produced heavier, combined in their nuclear, like, fusion processes, combined all these elements to produce heavier and heavier elements, and we then start getting, you know, and then from those elements they combine to form molecules, and the molecules combine to basically form things that resemble cells, like, singular cellular organisms that then form to basically then coordinate with other things to come here to this moment, to this very end of that Big Bang. So that you, in realizing that you are at the very end of that Big Bang, what you're about, right? So I would say all you're really about is basically that jigsaw puzzle piece. It's about basically finding the little place where you actually fit that completes the picture. That's all what it's all about. We can talk about mysticism, we can talk about, spiritual traditions, we can talk about all of these sorts of things. But at a human level, like, if you look at our evolution of our species biologically and all of the things that it has gone through, it was only to arrive in this particular place so that you can look out of this little fucking window of sight sound, feelings, smells, whatever, and say, I am, I exist, and this is what I see. And there's something profoundly deep in all of this, you know? And to say that this is all accidental, random, I would, yeah, I find that hard to believe. I would say we've only come this far so that we can basically appreciate who we really are. And I think that's probably the next level of our journey, you know. Once we see our true face, then maybe we can basically find a place to rest, you know, to conclude all of this, like, you know.